One look was enough for Ty Carpenter to guess that he was facing a ghost town, a completely abandoned and forsaken set of streets and small buildings. Still, he took the time to explore it to the best of his abilities, to be 100% sure there was nothing and no one salvageable within that perimeter. A couple of hours later, he was done kicking down doors and flinching away from the most rotten spots of the town. It was useless. There wasn't a single sign of life or hope in that place. He had to move on, and he wanted to get away from there before the night fell. The sun was just starting to set beyond the horizon when he reached the top of the hill that stood beyond the town. That was when everything started to go wrong. It started with a discreet sound, a buzz that might as well have come from an insect. He imagined beetles populating the meadow beyond the hill and almost smiled, but his experience warned him against optimistic expectations. The town he just left was so lifeless that even cockroaches were nowhere to be found. Was it realistic to hope that just a mile later he would stumble against a spot of life vibrant enough to have a large beetle flying towards him? No, that couldn't be a beetle at all. The sound turned louder and louder with each passing second. It wasn't the fluttering of wings against an exoskeleton. That was something metallic, cold, and inanimate as the buildings he left behind. Before it was too late, Ty Carpenter scurried towards one of the large rocks that stood out there on top of the hill. He pressed his back tightly to the rock and took a deep breath. That couldn't be happening. The sound was turning even louder, coming closer. There was no doubt about it. Ty wasn't alone anymore. He knew for a fact that no humans could be found around there, so there was something unknown approaching him. Very carefully, Ty edged closer to the side of the 7-foot-tall boulder he was hiding behind. His movements were slow and calculated. He studied his surroundings, the stretch of the world up there on the hill. There were plenty of bushes. Some looked burnt and brown, some were thriving with life. Some were specimens he had never seen before. The trees scattered around the area were all small and young, not big or thick enough to hide the creature moving slyly through them. Ty had to stifle a gasp. This was incredible. He wasn't hoping to catch anything like that in those coordinates. He didn't even know what he was seeing. It was a large silhouette, soft edges, a dark gray color, and about the size of the rock he was standing behind. It was fascinating, and it deserved a closer look, but Ty couldn't risk his own luck. He had 2 guns strapped to his belt, an assistant device that displayed a digital map of the area, and 3 explosives that only activated with a personal code. One of the guns was deadly, loaded with the strongest bullets available to him. The other one was ideal for this scenario. It was a tranquilizing gun. The darts were charged with a powerful sedative that would immobilize a creature that big in a minute, and he felt confident he could spare a second shot to make sure the creature lost consciousness in a matter of seconds. If he could get closer to it, if he could manage to study that thing before bringing it home, he would be regarded as a hero. With skillful fingers, Ty pulled out his tranquilizing gun. He aimed at the creature still buzzing softly through the trees and took one calming breath. And he shot. The effect was immediate, but not in the way he expected. The dart hit its target, but the tip of the needle crashed and splattered against a completely solid and unyielding surface of metal. "Shit," Ty whispered. As the dart fell pitifully to the ground, Ty realized this wasn't an animal at all. He was in the presence of some sort of robotic entity, something completely implausible, thoroughly unlikely, and yet it was undeniably there, turning around swiftly towards Ty. It was as if his foolish action flipped a switch. Gone was his dull exploration of a ghost town and the placid stroll up the hill. He was suddenly dragged down to the eye of a hurricane, where everything happened too fast and violently for him to keep up. The robot turned around, and one glance at a bright red eye on its front was all Ty needed. If it wasn't for his training, he would have died right then and there. The robot started shooting back at him, and Ty saved himself by merely an inch, hiding behind the rock again. It was a short-lived refuge. Something changed in the sounds the machine was making. gone were the high-pitched shots. A deep rumble like a jet's motors turning on was all the warning Ty got. He was in the middle of taking a breath when the robot shot at him again. The blast hit the rock and caused a small explosion that sent Ty's body flying a few feet in the air. Under any other circumstances, Ty would have landed on an uncomfortable heap on the ground, completely exposed and most likely incinerated by the lasers from his attacker within seconds. However, he was lucky enough that the hill he had just climbed was quite steep, at least enough for his body to keep rolling down after he crashed back down. Lucky, though, might have been an exaggeration. If the landing wasn't painful enough, as he rolled down the hill, he could feel his shoulders, his hips, and his head repeatedly hitting the rough ground, knocking against smaller rocks and getting his clothes torn and his entire body scratched. The tools and weapons on his belt dug painfully against his waist. But he couldn't exactly complain. He realized what was happening pretty quickly and did his best to just keep moving like that, descending the hill as fast as he could without stopping, without giving his attacker a chance to keep an eye on him. As soon as Ty heard the robot shoot again, he braced for the worst, but came out unscathed. The robot's shot missed him. When he realized this, Ty jumped to his feet as quickly as he could without losing his balance after the painful descent and ran towards the trees at the bottom of the hill. There weren't many of them, but they could give him enough cover for a few seconds. He hastily went over the facts. If the robot didn't hit him out in the open, it meant it wasn't as advanced as other models he'd heard of and personally seen in action before. If it didn't continue shooting rapid-fire laser hits, it meant it wasn't capable of it. That monstrosity didn't have perfect aim, and it took a few seconds before being able to shoot again. This information would be crucial if Ty wanted to survive. The odds were against him, but not everything was lost. Ty looked around him frantically and came up with a hurried plan of action. He could visualize his next steps, every spot where he could hide behind a tree, how long it would take him to reach the edge of the ghost town, and what he could do then to fight back against the robot chasing after him. His thoughts were violently interrupted by a loud booming noise and the ground shaking at his feet. He looked behind him, and there, on his right, a large tree was on fire and crumbling down, the heavy branches crashing on the grass after being hit by the robot's lasers. Ty took a deep breath and sprang into action. He could fool this imperfect model, he was sure of it. He ran to his left, all muscles tensed and adrenaline lighting him up. Upon reaching a new tree, he looked over his shoulder and saw the spheric, metallic enemy floating a foot off the ground and swiftly going down the hill directly towards him. That split-second look was enough. Ty jerked away and hurried to his right again, deeper into the trees. When he heard the robot shoot in his direction again, he threw himself to the ground, right behind a fallen log. He took the time to take a deep breath and silently go over the state of his body. His tense muscles were burning, his back still hurt from the fall down the hill, and he suspected a few scratches were currently bleeding, but nothing felt quite alarming yet. He could go on. He had to go on. Ty started crawling on the ground, pushing himself with his forearms as quietly as he could. He tried to look over his shoulder, but there was no sight of the robot close by. Instead, he saw ahead of him a tall chain-link fence. He had searched that place hours ago. He knew that beyond the fence there was an abandoned warehouse, and he knew for a fact that he'd left the back door unlocked. The robot was too big for that door, and, with that hopeful thought in mind, Ty jumped to his feet again and started running. He was confident in his ability to climb the fence, but halfway up he heard it. The ominous buzz, the rumble of his rival coming closer and closer, like a deadly storm chasing a frail ship in the middle of the ocean. Ty was right at the top of the fence, merely a second away from turning over and jumping safely to the ground right when the laser hit the fence. The metal reacted instantly. The fence crumbled down, sending pieces of wire flying all over and heating up enough to burn Ty's hands. He couldn't hold back his yell of extreme distress. He fell about 7 feet down to the ground. His body screamed in pain, his vision blurred, and, for a second, he entertained the idea of giving up, lying there on the ground, and waiting for death to take him. Slowly, Ty's eyes fluttered open, and he saw his enemy drifting closer through the trees. His body ran cold at the sight. It was much taller than him. The red eye on its front looked like a direct gateway to hell, and it was currently recharging to shoot at Ty again and end his life. But no, he couldn't allow that. He had to keep fighting at all costs. Ty groaned loudly as he stood up. All his muscles cried out at the effort, but he knew he could take even more, only to keep himself alive. He dragged his body to the back door of the warehouse and crashed inside just 5 seconds before the door was blown off its hinges, absolutely destroyed by the latest laser hit from the robot. Ty flinched away and scurried in the dark to find solace amongst the abandoned shelves. He dropped to the ground and tried to regain his breath. He was a mess. His clothes were dirty, torn, and now a little burnt too. The hit on the fence happened way too close. He couldn't take risks like that again. Right then and there, Ty decided that he had to fight back. Running away was no longer an option. That creature would catch up with him eventually. Ty was almost entirely certain that, since it had him targeted, the robot would find a way, sooner rather than later, to make its way into the building despite the small door. For this reason, Ty had to act quickly. The attacker was technologically advanced enough to shoot lasers and move itself hovering above the ground, but despite its sleek and robust design, because of its few mistakes, Ty chose to be hopeful and believe it wasn't indestructible. He let himself think he could take it down by himself, at least damage it enough so that it would stop going after him. But, of course, he didn't stand a chance trying to face that monstrosity face to face. Luckily for him, as soon as he looked around, he realized he was in the perfect place to set up a trap. Still, Ty had to be very quick. He was counting on the robot being able to crash into the building, but he had no way to know how long it would take. The warehouse was cramped and dirty. Everything that had ever been stored there was rotten, useless, and indistinguishable to him. He started by worsening the mess inside the warehouse, making the large shelves stumble against each other, blocking the door in a way that obviously wouldn't hold off the robot for too long, but would make it slow down as it moved through. Next, Ty took the 3 emergency explosives still attached to his belt. Maybe it wasn't wise to use all of them at once, but he would need all the power he could get. At least, he was confident the extremely old and useless materials in that large room would catch fire easily. He just needed to get away and activate the bombs at the right time. As he walked to the front door of the building, Ty was surprised by a very brief moment of nostalgia and wonder. He thought about the people that used to work in the warehouse, who they were, their names and stories. Why did they just leave, and where did they die? He wondered if they ever imagined that a man from very far away would one day fight a killer robot within the walls of their warehouse. That would look like an archaeological discovery at the time. But Ty couldn't keep entertaining those thoughts. He had to leave before the robot made its way in. Ty had barely made it across the street when he heard the first explosion. He accurately guessed that the robot, less powerful than the models he was used to, had to take some time to prepare for a bigger blast than the lasers it had been using to chase him. That first explosion meant it took down part of the wall to get inside the building, which, in turn, meant that the robot would face the mountain of junk and old metal shelves that Ty left for it. The robot would need to start shooting again, just to make its way through the warehouse towards where it assumed Ty would be. But then, Ty used the assistant device he carried with him to activate the 3 bombs, all at once. Ty managed to hide behind a house across the street at just the right second. The explosion was massive, loud, and incredibly destructive. The ground trembled. A fiery red light covered the entire little town. An acrid scent filled the air, and an angry black cloud of smoke rose from the ashes of the abandoned warehouse. Ty only dared to peek from the side of the house, just enough to get a good look at the flames still eating that poor broken building down. It was beautiful and devastating. His heart was racing, and for a moment, he couldn't even remember he was in danger and his body was sore and bleeding. He grinned, breathed deeply in celebration, and then his blissful expression started to fall. As much as he wished it wasn't the case, Ty knew that it wasn't completely certain that the explosion would eliminate the threat. It would have killed any man, but he was fighting against an inanimate mass of metal and electronic components. Maybe he got lucky and the explosion was enough, but he couldn't afford the luxury of staying there to make sure. He had to get away, and he had to do it quickly. Fortunately, he was familiar with that little ghost town. He made his way hastily through a couple of alleyways, and 4 streets later, he was on the edge of town. This time he was facing a small forest. Nothing too impressive, but thicker than the handful of trees by the hill where he first met the robot. He knew exactly where to go. He had reached the town in the first place coming through this forest. He knew the exact length of ground he would have to walk until he reached the wide clearing at the end. To the left, there would be a small, mostly dry and lifeless lake. To the right of the clearing, his spaceship was waiting for him. If only he could make it there, he'd be able to escape, send a distress signal, and warn the entire stretch of the universe that humanity had conquered that their old home had been invaded. Ty wasn't running anymore, but he was moving steadily, limping a little. He felt exhausted, but he couldn't let himself lower his guard now after everything. He was breathing heavily and his ears were ringing after the explosion in town. Still, he heard it. As soon as he reached the first trees, he heard the buzzing sound of the robot start again. He cursed his luck, and he kicked one of the trees. He felt compelled to cry and scream and just take his gun and die fighting if necessary, as long as the fight would just end already. Begrudgingly, Ty looked over his shoulder, but he couldn't see the robot yet. He moved through the trees, scanning the streets of the abandoned town. Like many others he had visited before, he couldn't see his enemy yet. He could imagine it, a furious ball of metal, rolling awkwardly on the ground, dropping small pieces of rubble on the way, unable to continue holding itself aloft, but more determined than ever before to completely annihilate Ty. As he turned, increasingly afraid, Ty scurried through the trees. He was distracted, constantly looking behind him and fearing the worst. His body was aching all over, begging for some rest, complaining every single step of the way. His legs were failing him. He kept tripping on tree roots and loose rocks on the ground. He knocked his shoulder against the trees. He picked himself back up from every fall, and he felt drops of sweat falling down his temples. No matter how fast he walked away from the scene of the fight, the sound of the robot approaching was turning louder and louder. It was a nightmare. It was psychological torture. That steady droning sound was going to be the death of him one way or another. His only consolidation was that, through the cluster of trees, he was finally able to spot his spaceship waiting for him. He could have wept in utter relief. The sound of the robot felt like it was surrounding him, threatening to drown him. It was starting to feel like it came from inside his head, but it didn't matter, Ty thought. He was almost at his destination. He was almost safe and free. There was only one problem. There was something wrong with his ship. More specifically, there was something wrong going around his ship. Ty couldn't stop running. He couldn't believe his eyes. It wasn't until he reached the edge of the woods that he fell to his knees and accepted the truth. There were about 20 new robots in front of his ship. They all looked exactly the same. Same size, same color, same bright red eye, and all of them hovering a foot or two above the ground. Ty felt like he couldn't breathe. He had never known such a strong feeling of hopelessness. He was beyond devastated, and he only hoped his death would be a quick and painless affair. When he was able to tear his eyes away from his blocked and surrounded ship, he realized that one of the robots was coming out of the trees and approaching. He had never been so close to the other, and this one looked even bigger, much more threatening. The red light at the front illuminated the ground underneath and inched slowly towards Ty, only scanning him at first. When he thought he would have died already, instead, Ty heard a voice say,
"Identify yourself."
It was mildly distorted, a regular computerized tone. He sighed, so the robots were programmed to speak. He wasn't sure if that made a difference, The other one hadn't seemed very interested in striking up a conversation with him. "My name is Ty Carpenter," he said, numb and dejected. The robot addressed him again, saying,
"Explain your presence on planet Earth."
"I'm a visitor," Ty answered. "Every decade for the past 100 years, we have sent selected individuals to return to Earth for a year, explore the continents, observe how much the planet has healed itself since humans evacuated, and determined if it's possible to return anytime soon." The robot took its sweet time processing the information. Ty didn't even consider trying to escape. He knew he didn't stand a chance. But he was tempted to ask his own questions, see if the computer would be able to reply to him. Then the robot spoke to him again.
"And what has been your assessment so far?"
Ty had to think for a moment, but he answered honestly. "Well, it's only been a month," he explained. "I haven't seen much, but I was able to take off my suit and helmet. It's almost ready, I think. The air is good again. That's an extremely good sign. These trees are fresh and young. Also good news. The town is still standing, technically. I'm just concerned about the lack of large animals," but Ty's speech was very suddenly interrupted. The robot in front of him yelled. It spoke in an extremely loud and urgent tone.
"Stop! Don't shoot! Don't you dare shoot!"
Ty flinched, trembled, and held his hands above his head. He hadn't even thought about grabbing his guns, but then he finally realized that there was a new sound coming from behind him. He turned around just in time to see the bright red eye of a robot start to dim, giving up its plans to shoot him in the back and kill him at once. It was the robot he had exploded back in town. It looked just like Ty had imagined, covered in ashes, missing some parts on its surface, dragging itself pitifully through the ground instead of floating easily. It was as if Ty could feel the thing's hatred towards him. And then, he heard it talking.
"But he fucking tried to kill me."
Before Ty could begin to question or try to understand that unfamiliar attitude on a robot, the other one replied.
"And whose fault is that? Who got fucking exposed even though we knew there was one of them around the zone? We were supposed to keep our distance, let him wander around like a lost puppy for a bit, and then he would leave us the fuck alone. But you couldn't do that, could you? And now we have a situation."
Ty looked from one robot to the other, trying and failing to make sense of everything he was hearing. Then, the robotic voice was interrupted by a completely new set of sounds. Something cracking open, a hissing sound, the slow but steady opening of the upper half of both robots. Ty couldn't believe his eyes. Both spheres opened up, a thin cloud of smoke came out, and as soon as it cleared, Ty was able to see the people inside both machines. The insides of the machines were glittering with blinking lights coming from a control panel that went all around the seat in the middle of the cabin. On the seat of the larger robot, there was a woman. She looked stern and deeply annoyed with the situation in front of her. On the seat of the robot he blew up in the warehouse, there was a man that looked absolutely furious with him. He looked as bad as his own vehicle. Hair a mess, rumpled clothes, and everything dirty and covered with thin sheets of black ashes. The man looked at the woman that seemed like someone of higher rank somehow, and he pointed an angry finger at Ty.
"That asshole could have killed me,"
he insisted. The woman chuckled.
"That was actually pretty impressive."
And Ty protested. "You started it! You shot me at first sight!"
"Hell no, you shot one of your pathetic little darts at me, and now you have to pay for it."
There was an ominous pause. The man smiled, and then he talked to Ty in a frightening, condescending tone.
"You won't be the first one we kill, and you won't be the last."
Ty's blood went cold at the thought. It was only then that he remembered that it was true. He heard all the stories about previous visitors that never returned home. They landed on Earth, and then no one heard news from them again. Ty finally knew exactly what had happened, what awful fate they had faced, and exactly what kind of risks he was dealing with. Before his thoughts spiraled out of control, the woman spoke up again.
"Calm down,"
she ordered.
"No one is killing anyone. Let us explain ourselves, all right?"
She jumped off her machine, and the thing continued to hover easily above the ground, waiting for her return. Ty wasn't foolish enough to think this meant he was safe or had the upper hand in any way. He was still on his knees, and the woman also had a gun strapped to the belt of her pants. Ty didn't think it was tranquilizing darts, and finally, she explained everything to him.
Ty Carpenter, my name is Julian Turner. I'm a regional leader of a society that grew out of the unlucky bastards that were abandoned on Earth when everyone else evacuated. History says that the first years were incredibly difficult. Most people lived underground, hiding from the effects of the war and the contamination and chaos that your kind left on the planet. Fortunately, with the large majority of the human population gone, the planet started to recover quickly, and we crawled out of the dark, slowly but surely making the best we could with leftovers from a fallen society. But I think we did pretty well, haven't we? We evolved, we sustained ourselves, and every 10 years we hide and we watch one of you roam our territory for a year until we can go our separate ways again. Isn't that marvelous?
Ty had to admit that it was, indeed, a fascinating story, something he never imagined, and something he couldn't wait to share with everyone else. His name would be going down in history as the man that discovered a secret society back on planet Earth. He would be the hero that reconnected both ends of humanity again. Plus, he would be the first visitor to fulfill his mission. If these people had been living and thriving on the planet this entire time, then it meant everyone else could come back at any time. I have to go back. I have to report this, Ty said, quietly, completely struck by the grandiose of the moment. And then, everything came crashing down.
We can't let you do that,
Julian Turner said. She had been casually leaning against her vehicle with her arms crossed and a vaguely amused look on her face. But then she turned quite serious and somber. She walked slowly towards Ty and looked down at him as she said,
We don't want you and your people back, Ty Carpenter. You ended the world once, and we won't let you do it again. It took a lot of work to get us to this point. We don't want intruders, we don't want any disruption, and we don't want our secret exposed to the rest of the universe.
Ty opened his mouth to speak, but no sounds came out. Just when he started to recover his hope, everything started to look even worse than ever. His hands were shaking, he was drenched in a cold sweat, and he heard the man he almost killed laughing somewhere behind him. Ty turned around slowly to look at him and his devilish smile. He said,
Don't look so terrified, Ty Carpenter. We don't have to kill you. Not yet. We could use some information on what's been going on outside this little rock in space. Most importantly, we could really use the resources in your ship. We could take it apart, improve our situation, fix the robot you tried to blow up. It's all good. We'll be good for each other, Ty. What do you say?
When he was done, the woman cleared her throat. Ty looked up at her again, and she offered him her hand. Ty hesitated. He couldn't believe the turn his life had taken. But then that woman, Julian Turner, stated her final argument.
Well, it's not really up to you.
She laughed.
You'll be our prisoner until we know we can trust you, but hey, welcome home.
Hey sci-fi horror fans, it's John. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Craving for another scary story? Click on that video on your screen. Until next time, everyone, and remember, stay cosmic.